I'm John Shortle, the Director for Joint History, and it's my privilege today to introduce Dr. David Crist. He's a undergraduate from the University of Virginia, and he got his PhD in history from Florida State University. A Marine Corps officer, he deployed during Desert Storm, OIF, and OEF, and he's a colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. His recent book, The Twilight War, examines the contradictory response of American policymakers to the Iranian Revolution over the past 33 years. It's the culmination of more than 20 years of research on his part. His study of the 1988 tanker wars, which was done while he was on a fellowship at the Washington Institute, so impressed General Mattis that General Mattis brought him down to CENTCOM as an advisor on Iran. And he served in this capacity to 2 sinks at CENTCOM. We're fortunate to have him here today to talk to us about the U.S.-Iranian relations. Dr. Crist.
Good afternoon, and thanks for taking some time out of your schedule to talk to me, or to listen to me talk, I guess I should say. First, I'd just like to say that this presentation's my own views. They don't represent the Department of Defense, so if I say something you don't like, direct the angry, rotten fruit at me, not at General Dempsey or anyone else. As I look around at the audience and see some people who I know have worked Iran for many years, I'm always reminded of the sage words that a professor gave me in graduate school that I completely chose to ignore, which is, if you're going to write on a topic that's controversial, in this case is Iran, make sure the subject matter is old enough that all the participants are dead. So unfortunately, I didn't do that. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who many of you know is ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other Middle East countries, his first posting was to Khorramshahr in Iran in the early 1970s. And he said, for Iran, history is not the past, but the present. And I think that's a statement that adequately captures both nations today. We're both captive of history, and the events of more than 30 years ago continue to shape both countries. And I think an understanding of this history is the key to devising a way forward for the United States regarding Iran. The Iran problem is one of the enduring constants in American foreign policy. For 3 decades, the two nations have been suspended between peace and war, between the light and the darkness and the twilight, hence the title of my book. With no diplomatic relations and only episodic meetings between diplomats, relations have ping-ponged back and forth between the prospect of a hopeful dialogue of peace and the smell of cordite and talk of war. Every administration since Jimmy Carter has faced the Iranian conundrum. Administrations are frequently divided between those who advocate finding ways to work with the Islamic Republic and those who see the regime itself as a singular problem. And this was true from the very outset. As most of you know, until the 1979 revolution, Iran had been a key American ally. The Shah of Iran could purchase any weapon short of nuclear weapons, and his robust military was the key for the American defense policy for the Persian Gulf during the Cold War. In a toast for the Shah in December 1977, President Jimmy Carter famously described him as an island of stability in one of the most troubled areas. But the U.S. defense policy rested on a foolish, sickly old man. He alienated much of the population by gross mismanagement and corruption, coupled with rapid modernization and secularization. 2 years after President Carter's toast, the Shah would be deposed in a popular revolt. The Iranian Revolution divided Jimmy Carter's administration. His would not be the first. On one hand, there was those like Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and the U.S. Ambassador in Tehran, Sullivan, both of whom argued that the Shah's days were numbered, and the sooner the U.S. shifted and started making relations with Ayatollah Khomeini and the opposition, the better the U.S. would be in the long run. On the other hand, there was those like National Security Advisor Brzezinski, who advocated that the U.S. should, at a minimum, urge the Iranian military leadership to stage a coup. And even argued, as the Shah started to crumble, his regime started to crumble, introduction of U.S. combat forces to actually prop up the Shah. Between these two views, Carter vacillated. As a result, you end up with Carter dispatching a presidential envoy by the name of General Dutch Heiser, who was the EUCOM commander at the time, with instructions to go to Iran, and his instructions were so muddled, Heiser didn't know if he should tell the Iranian military to stage a coup or urge them to support Khomeini. As a result, the U.S. doesn't do anything very well. Tehran had one of the largest CIA stations in the world, but it was focused largely on the Soviet Union at the time, not internally. So when the revolt and revolution happens, the U.S. is scrambling to try to find people who could have better insight to what was going on in the streets. They turned to a Foreign Service officer named Stan Escudero, whose story I think is frankly a lot more interesting than the one Ben Affleck did in Argo. Escudero is a Mexican-American from Daytona, Florida, who happened to be fluent in Farsi. Posted to Iran, but he made the mistake of writing a cable that was very critical of U.S. policy of putting all our foreign policy eggs in the Shah's basket. And for that sin, he was relegated to an obscure job in the basement over in Foggy Bottom. But when the revolution happened, he was pulled out of mothballs and thrown into Tehran. Escudero, in addition to being fluent in Farsi, had a dark, kind of swarthy complexion, a big, huge, black, bushy beard, and he looked Iranian, or at least looked enough like an Iranian from the Americans' perspective. So what he does is he infiltrates the demonstrators. So by day, Escudero's in the front line, getting shot at on a number of occasions by the Shah's police, saying, "Death to the Shah, death to the Shah." And then at night, he would sneak back to the U.S. Embassy and report to Ambassador Sullivan on what was going on in the streets. And he quickly came to this exact same opinion Sullivan. The Shah's days were numbered, and the sooner the U.S. starts dealing with the opposition, the better off the U.S. policy will be. Interestingly, 30 years later, George W. Bush, in his first term, would face similar divisions within his administration in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. The administration was divided over the wisdom of engaging Iran versus the need to isolate and press for eventual regime change. The Iranian leaders were shocked by the scope of the 9/11 attacks and perhaps worried that they might find themselves in the American crosshairs in the aftermath. They made a series of openings to the United States. These culminated in a very fruitful relationship with Ambassador Dobbins and the bond talks, which sets up the Karzai and the Afghan government. And Iran even offered to provide their port of Chabahar to resupply U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Both Chairman General Myers and Secretary of State Powell, neither one had great love for Iran, but they didn't advocate isolation and recommended that on certain areas where interests converged, we should talk to the Iranians. Ambassador Ryan Crocker was dispatched and he began a series of quiet meetings with Iranian officials in both Paris and Geneva, primarily on Afghanistan, but also the potential was it might spread to other areas, Iraq specifically. But on the other side of the argument in the administration, there were deep suspicions of Iran's motives. Any official contact with Iran gave support to the government and undermined our efforts to delegitimize the regime, Peter Rodman, a senior defense official, wrote at the time. And Rumsfeld echoed these concerns in a memo for President Bush, stating that the long-term goal should be regime change and not accommodation. In between these two competing views, the president doesn't come down on a single decision. And what you end up with is the axis of evil speech, a hard-nosed speech against the Iranian leadership that after the president said it in the State of the Union speech, completely undercut the Ryan Crocker talks. And it's not followed up with anything concrete to push for eventual regime change. So we sort of squander a couple of opportunities, particularly on engagement. Both the United States and Iran, I think, bear responsibility for perpetuating the current antagonisms and keeping relations in the twilight. Suspicion, apathy, domestic politics in both countries, uncertainty whether improved relations are really in one country's interest, and a view that when one country wants to talk, they must be weak. So why do we really want to talk to a country when we have the upper hand? When one side sees it in the interest to reach out, the other one doesn't see it as in their interests. And this has gone on for 30 years. Two quick examples. President George H.W. Bush 41's inaugural speech, he reached out to the Iranians with a line that said, "Goodwill begets goodwill." And what he was trying to do was improve relations with Iran and hopefully end a hostage crisis in Lebanon. If you recall, there was a number of Americans and Westerners being held by Hezbollah at the time. And through his national security advisor, through the UN Secretary General, he reaches out to the Iranians and essentially says, if you get the hostages released, that this will lead to better relations between the two countries. There's a new president in Iran, President Rafsanjani, who's in the news again as a potential presidential candidate. We'll see if he makes it. Rafsanjani was seen as a more pragmatic man. I firmly believe that Rafsanjani's interests are in Mammon, not the Imam. And he's a man who Bush thought we could work with, a change in pace. At some considerable political expense, Rafsanjani works with Hezbollah for about 3 years to get all the Western hostages released. And there was a lot of backlash in the ruling elite in Tehran to his efforts. And when it comes time for reciprocity, in other words, he passes a note through the United Nations, the hostages are released, goodwill begets goodwill. What looked like a good idea to George H.W. Bush in 1989 didn't look so good going into election year in 1992. So the U.S. comes up with a new litany of grievances against the Iranians and essentially shuts down and says we're not going to honor our initial statement. And the Iranians never got over this. So years later, Richard Haas, who some of you may know, he was on the Council of Foreign Relations now. Then he worked for Scowcroft on the National Security Council. Years later, met the Iranian foreign minister at our meeting in Geneva. And when he was introduced, the Iranian foreign minister said, oh yes, Mr. Goodwill begets goodwill. And Iran, too, has missed some golden opportunities. President Clinton, very late in his term, reached out to the Iranians. Madeleine Albright, as Secretary of State, apologized for our overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953, which those of you who've seen Argo was an early feature in that film and a prominent grievance of the Iranians. And Clinton tried to arrange a accidental meeting with the Iranian President Khatami at the UN General Assembly meeting in September 2000. And the plan was that after Clinton gave his speech, Khatami was the next one or the following one. Clinton would wait in an anteroom, and when Khatami came out, they could have a, quote, accidental meeting, shake hands. And this might be, following up with what Madeleine Albright said, a breakthrough in U.S.-Iranian relations. Unfortunately, Khatami, the Supreme Leader, refused to give Khatami permission to meet with President Clinton. So while Clinton's sort of cooling his heels in an anteroom, Khatami spurried out a side door after his speech, and frankly, they never meet. And the Iranians it was just a bridge too far for Iran at the time. Does this mean that there are not serious divisions between the two countries? No. Both sides have far different views of the future of the Middle East. For Iran, the 1979 revolution enshrined anti-Americanism as a key pillar of Iranian foreign policy. And the young men who shouted death to the Shah and overthrew a popular American-backed dictator now have gray in their beards, but in many ways their attitudes remain unchanged. Tehran rejects the current status quo of American preeminence in the region, and they see the United States' ultimate goal is always overthrowing the revolution. And I don't see any of this as likely to change in the foreseeable future. And frankly, since June of 2009 elections, many of the more pragmatic voices, including Rafsanjani's, have been marginalized. This animosity frequently results in Iran's misinterpreting American actions. In fact, they're terrible about understanding what really motivates the United States. And this has had some very potentially dangerous consequences. Many of you remember Operation Desert Fox in 1998. You may have participated in it. Saddam Hussein kicks out UN's weapons inspectors. The U.S. builds up and then launches a series of airstrikes against him as punishment. Well, anyone reading the New York Times could see that the U.S. was building up forces to strike Iraq, except for the Supreme Leader, who apparently his subscription had lapsed, because he interprets this as a pending strike on Iran proper. And the Iranians go to the equivalent of DEFCON 1 in anticipation of a war. And you can imagine the potential for miscalculation in an environment like that. And there are many examples of that. While I see the U.S. as the good guy in this, I'm show my own bias, we have not always been the perfect guy. And our own actions have helped build on this foundation of distrust that began with the dramatic events of 1979. Well, I think U.S. intelligence has been pretty good at ascertaining Iranian intentions, other than missing the revolution in 1978. But in general, I think we've been pretty good. At the policy level, however, we have consistently shown a lack of appreciation for how our actions will be viewed in Tehran. And there are a lot of examples, but the best one is an incident that happened in July 1988. The U.S. cruiser Vincennes, what's in the Persian Gulf at the time, instigates a fight with Iranian small boats in Iranian waters. And in the middle of this fight that the U.S. essentially provoked, an aircraft takes off from Bandar Abbas. The Vincennes mistakes it for an F-14, shoots it down, and it turns out to be an Iranian Airbus, and it kills 290 civilians. The U.S.'s response in this had very little to do with considerations of Iran. Instead, what the U.S. does was we obfuscate, we're a little bit liberal with the truth in our testimony at the United Nations about where the Vincennes was, and then most egregiously, we reward the captain of the Vincennes with the Legion of Merit. And really, this is done for reasons that have everything to do with a change in rules of engagement at the time in the mid-'80s, which is stressing hostile intent. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Crowell, saw this as a way of emphasizing to all the ship's captains, the command will support you if you take action to defend your ship. But of course, Iran doesn't see any of that inside the baseball politics and the U.S. military. What they see is that the U.S. shot down one of their airliners, essentially lies about what caused the incident, and then, by the way, if it's an accident, why did you give the guy a medal? And so, interestingly, the current commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy is a guy by the name of Ali Fadavi. Ali Fadavi was the commander of the small boats in the engagement with the Vincennes. And he has never gotten over this. He said it quite publicly that if he gets a chance to even the score against the U.S. for what he thought was a deliberate act of terrorism by the United States, he will do it. Compounding this, all these issues have been a consistent, I think, reticence by the U.S. to establish clear red lines and respond to Iranian malign activities. 1983, Iranian surrogates, but clearly at the behest of Iran, bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut twice and bombed the Marine barracks, which kills 241 American servicemen. After a lot of hemming and hawing, the Reagan administration doesn't respond to any of these attacks militarily. More significantly, perhaps, it was in Iraq, an experience I'm sure many of you in the audience know all about. Iran deliberately floods advanced form projectiles and other munitions to their surrogates in Iraq with the deliberate aim of eroding American resolve by killing U.S. servicemen. And the U.S. hems and haws for several years. It's not till December 2006 before the Bush administration takes any action at all against the Iranian activities in Iraq, by which time 140 American servicemen had died. And I think you could make an argument that the plot to kill the Saudi ambassador in 2011, there was no U.S. response for that either, despite the fact that perhaps drive enough of some of Cafe Milano's customers down. So anyway, the U.S. hasn't taken a very firm resolution, which I think in many ways has emboldened Iran's activities. Now, having said that, there has been some hopes of potential peace or at least better rapport. I mentioned the incident, the Crocker meetings that were unfortunately shut down after the Axis of Evil speech. But perhaps one of the best opportunities came amidst the greatest scandal of the Reagan administration, the Iran-Contra issue. Reagan had taken a two-track policy with Iran. One was containing the spread of the Iranian Revolution, particularly to the Saudi provinces and to Kuwait and elsewhere, Bahrain. And the other was to try to find ways that people within the Iranian government who might be favorably disposed to the U.S. that we can work with to woo the Iranians back to the American side of the Cold War. And he tries both, and basically pursues both these policies. In the fall of 1985, at the instigation of the Israelis, the U.S. begins providing Iran with Hawk missiles, TOW missiles, F-4 spare parts, intelligence on Iraqi troop dispositions, as part of a complex scheme to get the hostages in Lebanon released, which would be the quid pro quo for providing these weapons, which would then ingratiate the United States to specific moderates in the Iranian government, and that all this would lead to a normalization between the two countries. It didn't work. In fact, it sort of degrades into an arms for hostage. The U.S. would give them a pallet load of TOW missiles, and one or two hostages would come out of Lebanon, only to have Hezbollah take one or two more. So it really didn't work. But the interesting thing is, if you really go back and look at that, the U.S. did achieve a pretty significant impact in the sense that we were in direct communication with the highest levels of the Iranian government. Ayatollah Khomeini approved the arms and hostage deal. Many of the senior Iranians of the Green Movement, Mehdi Karoubi, Prime Minister Mousavi, names that may be familiar with to you, were key players in this saga. Mousavi ran the day-to-day operations of it. And it resulted in some very strange meetings between the two countries. The only exchange between Washington and Tehran that we've had since 1979. In the spring of 1986, former National Security Advisor Bud McFarlane, plus an NSC official, Lieutenant Colonel North, and a CIA fellow and some communication equipment, flew to Tehran to meet with the Iranians as opposed to something they thought was going to be this grand bargain of releasing all the hostages in Lebanon in return for a pallet full of sophisticated Hawk missiles. Unfortunately, they hadn't laid enough preliminary groundwork. There had been no exchange of this. So the Americans arrive in Tehran, and as one of the participants in this meeting described it to me, all of a sudden the Iranians are like, holy shit, the Americans are here. What do we do now? And so they scramble to try to get a meeting together. Bottom line is that the whole thing falls through because the Iranians aren't prepared and can't react enough to a former American National Security Advisor showing up in their capital. And likewise, interestingly, roughly the same time, Rafsanjani's nephew, who was a guy by the name Barhimi, is a very senior Revolutionary Guard official then, and is, I think, in the Majlis today, the Iranian parliament, shows up in Washington with a couple of other Revolutionary Guard colonels to discuss with the United States on potential improved relations and on a host of different issues. And all these guys are given a private tour of the Oval Office. If you could imagine Revolutionary Guard officers strolling around the Oval Office, that's what happened. Neither one of these really come to fruition, nor does this entire effort of Reagan administration, in part because there's forces in both capitals who don't want better relations. Both Secretary of State Schultz and Secretary of Defense Weinberger were adamant against this opening from the very beginning. When I interviewed Weinberger in 2001, he still had gotten over it. He said, you can't trust, wasting your breath on the Iranians to try to negotiate to them. And he frankly never got over the embassy takeover. And the whole caper was exposed by the Iranian side. A guy by the name of Ayatollah Montazeri, who was Ayatollah Khomeini's chosen successor at the time, really, he didn't like the idea of working with the great Satan and getting arms and weapons from him. And he exposed this, exposed the caper's way of embarrassing Khomeini. And perhaps his real sin was when McFarland and North were meeting with the Iranians in Tehran, he organized a demonstration against them. So McFarland, North, and the rest of the team are whisked out a back alley back to the airport while a whole mob of people storming on the Tehran Hilton to try to break up these meetings. And for that, Ayatollah Khomeini cut him out of his succession and had a couple of his cousins killed too, just to send a message. But ultimately what this did, while there was efforts by both the State Department and the Iranians to continue this private dialogue, the public furor both in Iran and in the United States to this secret dealings sent both sides running for cover. And frankly, it would be the Iranians and Americans would not meet again till the Crocker meetings in 2000. So, now if there's been glimmers of better relations, the two have also come very close to war. The most significant occurred during the tanker wars of the 1980s. The Iran-Iraq War had bogged down into a stalemate reminiscent of World War I. And to try to break this stalemate, both countries started attacking shipping of the other in the Persian Gulf. Iran's attacks focused on neutral shipping headed to the Gulf states, particularly Kuwait, who were significant supporters of the Iraqi war effort, in the case of Kuwait allowing military hardware to transit their ports. By the end of the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian forces had attacked 190 ships in the Persian Gulf from 31 different nations, killing at least 63 sailors. In the spring of 1987, Kuwait requested American protection for their oil tankers, and the U.S. agreed to reflag 11 Kuwaiti tankers under the Stars and Stripes and provide military escort to safeguard them from Iranian attacks. and this led to the first American direct military intervention against Iran. But it was a very strange conflict. For the most part, it was waged, as the CENTCOM commander at the time termed it, a guerrilla war at sea. More reminiscent in many ways of Iraq and Afghanistan than the Battle of Midway. Iran's chief means of striking back were asymmetrical: terrorism, mines, and swarms of small boats. Iran especially liked mines and terrorism because it afforded them plausible deniability. It was difficult to determine who laid a mine or blew up an embassy. It was difficult to pin it back on Iran, and frankly, this still remains a hallmark of the way Iranians operate. Iran employed an improvised Mosquito fleet of Revolutionary Guard small boats. And if you picture your bass boat with a rocket launcher on it, you sort of have an idea what these are. Armed with machine guns and this kind of stuff. They lacked firepower to sink an oil tanker or U.S. warship, but in swarm attacks, they could inflict a significant amount of damage. And they operated from the islands and oil platforms in the Persian Gulf, which served as command and control sites and forward operating bases for these small boats who can't stay out in the water very much. So they'd operate from an oil platform, which would then pick up the American ships and tankers, and these things could sally forth to try to attack an isolated tanker or isolated American warship. Iran also relied heavily on mines, but Iranian mines were not the most sophisticated mines. In fact, it was a 1908 Russian-designed pre-World War I mine. They had purchased a few from the North Koreans. They had reverse engineered it and were manufacturing them in a factory near Tehran. But they proved pretty effective. Iran would lay 91 mines against the U.S. Convoy effort. 1 in 10 found a target, including in one case one of their own tankers. But these things happen. And they proved effective. For the cost of $1,500 for one of these cheap mines, one of them nearly sank the USS Samuel B. Roberts, inflicting today what would be about $500 million worth of damage on it. The U.S. military developed, I think, a very unique, although controversial way to deal with this unorthodox Iranian threat. The tactical commander in the Gulf at the time was Rear Admiral Harold Burnson, and he wrote in a memo to the CENTCOM commander, "In my view, to be successful, we must establish intensive patrol operations to prevent the Iranians from laying mines. I believe we can achieve the desired results with a mixture of relative small boat craft and helicopters." And what Burnson's idea was essentially to increase our ISR capabilities, to use our current term, and at the same time saturate the 500 nautical mile long tanker route with patrols. And I always like to make the analogy, if you're looking at the MSR that ran from Kuwait to Baghdad, how do you guard it against insurgents? Well, the concept is very similar. You have presence, you have persistence, and this kind of thing. Only in this case, you're doing it with helicopters, warships, and small boats. The concept was the same. The U.S. converted 2 400-foot-long oil construction barges into what amounts to an offshore forward operating base. And they deployed them up in the northern part of the Gulf where the Iranian small boats and mining have been particularly active. And on these, they stationed American small boats, U.S. Navy small boats, Army Special Forces helicopters, SEALs, and Marines, who would then range and have a constant patrol and presence up in the northern area with the ability to respond to anything the Iranians might throw at them. And all this system worked. Then short order, the U.S. had attacked and seized an Iranian mine layer, the Iran Ajar, which was a lighter that was used to do logistics runs from Bandar Abbas to Bushehr, guys going on furlough back and forth, that the Revolutionary Guard had turned it into an improvised mine layer and sort of sailed it out to drop some mines off and catch the U.S. warships off of Bahrain. U.S. discovered it and attacked and captured it with most of the mines. There are a lot of engagements in this conflict, but I think one bears some worth mentioning. It was called Operation Hodge. And in war, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. In this case, the U.S. was a little of both. The Iranians decided to do a reprisal attack against the Saudis for killing of some of the Revolutionary Guard pilgrims and support of the U.S. and this tanker and whatever sins they had against the Saudis, sins they probably still have against the Saudis. But it was a pretty elaborate attack. They massed 30 plus of these small boats, some regular Navy warships up in Bushehr, which is in the northern part of the Gulf, and were in the process of doing a large-scale attack on the Saudi offshore oil infrastructure. And you can imagine what this would do. Well, fortunately for the United States, the lead Iranian naval planner was a guy by the name of Taraji Riyahi. And Riyahi was been educated in the United States. He was made wine in his own basement, loved American movies. He didn't meld or blend with the current Iranian regime in a lot of ways. And he tipped the United States off that this attack was coming. The United States prepares. Unfortunately, the first day the Iranians are going to do the attack, the sea state's too high, so they don't launch it. A week later, they decide to relaunch this attack on Saudi Arabia, by which time the first of one of those converted oil barges is in place and doing patrols. Now, the CO of that barge who was a SEAL lieutenant commander, had no idea that, of anything of Taraji Riyahi or any larger attack the week before. It was, outside of his clearance level. But he did normal patrols, and one of his three of his Army helicopters happened to stumble on the vanguard of this Iranian attack and promptly blew the Iranians out of the water. Iran got nervous. Suddenly, the appearance of American helicopters, they call off the attack, never try it again, but unfortunately, they trace it back to Taraji Riyahi, and he's hanged a year later. All this conflict culminated in April 1988, when the USS Samuel B. Roberts was steaming in the Gulf, struck an Iranian-made mine that cracked the entire hull. In fact, the deck plate was the only thing holding the ship together. 4 days later, the U.S. responds in a running battle across the Gulf, which is to this day, the Navy's largest surface engagement since World War II. And at the end of the day, sink half the operational fleet of the Navy, killing, by my estimate, at least 60 Iranian sailors, all for the loss of one American helicopter. And that effectively ends the Iranian challenge to the U.S. operation. So in conclusion, let me see, where are we today? Well, the advantage of being a historian as opposed to intel officers, I really don't have to predict the future, so I won't. But I do think the likelihood of conflict with Iran remains high. Even if we solve the current nuclear standoff, this is really a symptom and not the cause of our problem. Even if the P5+1 talks succeed in resolving that bit of the crisis, this larger antagonism with Iran will remain. For beyond just an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, war can occur through miscalculation. An incident at sea spirals out of control. If those of you who look at this, every week there seems to be an incident between aggressive Iranian small boats and a U.S. warship, any one of which the wrong mistake by either side could result in a shooting conflict, or perhaps an attack on one of our aircrafts. It was announced in the press that on 1 November, Iranians tried to shoot down one of our unarmed Predators over international airspace. However, unlike the Cold War, there is no red phone between the two countries. In the absence of diplomatic relations between the two nations in this twilight war could easily turn a minor skirmish in the Gulf into a larger shooting conflict. And frankly, sometimes we even struggle to find out who to talk to. To go back to George H.W. Bush, early in his administration, he even returned a crank phone call from Tehran with somebody he thought was President Rafsanjani. He spoke to the man for a half hour before he realized this isn't the Iranian president. So, like I say, sometimes it can be hard even to find who to talk to at the other end. So despite President Obama's decision to pivot to the Pacific, the reality of the Middle East has a way of mucking up grand designs of American presidents. And I remain convinced that the events in the Middle East will continue to take us back repeatedly to that region, with Iran the likely antagonist. Like the predecessors in the White House, including Dwight David Eisenhower, who came to office focused on Korea and the Cold War, as he noted in his memoirs, no region of the world received as much of my close attention and that of my colleagues as did the Middle East. Thank you. And we got 25 minutes for your Rotten Tomatoes, so questions? Sir?
With the falling media age, possible that we can just have
Well, I tend to think so. I think nature will eventually take its course. The only downside is there's something in the water at Gom, because these guys have a tendency to live a very long time. So we may have to wait a while for this supreme leader to go. But I don't think you're going to, as I said, we're not going to see any change until there's a change. I mean, Iran is still governed by the revolutionary generation. As I said, all these guys did time, in the Iran-Iraq War, and did time in some cases as part of the instigators of the revolution. They're in their 20s then, they're in their 50s now. And I don't think we're going to see a radical change or even sort of a significant change in Iran until these guys go. But it is true. I think something like 75% of the Iranian population weren't even born when the revolution happened. So it's ancient history for a lot of them, except it's not for the leaders who continually sort of wallow in it in many ways.
Isn't it, sorry, would it be possible to have a quiet change, but also
Yeah, well, I'm a huge. Well, I'm a big believer in engagement with Iran. I mean, and I'll steal somebody else a lot smarter than me's words for this, is Ambassador Crocker, who said you engage a country for 3 reasons. One is to make sure that you can get a message to them clear. 2, to make sure you get a better insight from where they're coming through from. And 3, it provides a venue to mess with their minds, which Crocker enjoyed doing as well. But so I think I do think there is, and I think the more that Iran is opened up and not closed off, the more you have student exchanges and these sorts of things, the more it does facilitate that. I mean, George Bush in his second term, I sort of trashed him in his first term, but his second term, I mean, he had a much more, I think, coherent Iran policy, a lot of which continues in place today. And a lot of it, I mean, he had a whole democratic initiative effort designed to try to achieve exactly that. And I think by opening up, much like we did with the Soviet Union and the East Bloc, that I think was pretty successful. Sir?
So what type of engagement?
Well, I think, I mean, it always takes 2 to tango. And, I can say the U.S. hasn't reached out, and in some cases we haven't. The Iranians haven't been very receptive either. And I'm convinced the Supreme Leader is not is very lukewarm to the idea of having any rapport with the United States. So, I mean, both sides, I think, bear responsibility for this. But, I mean, for mine, I'm thinking more diplomatic engagement. I mean, it would be nice if we could, just the ability to exchange messages. I mean, right now we do it through a series of intermediaries. The Swiss are the protecting power, and we'll send faxes back and forth, or through some other countries. We've had some episodic meetings in Iraq and that kind of thing. But, I mean, we don't have the ability to sit down with an Iranian and just, much like we did in the Cold War. And I think the Cold War could have been very different if we hadn't had that continuous dialogue with the Russians. Iran is not the Soviet Union. The stakes are not as high, but I think there's a validity to the idea. Sir? I'm not real optimistic. I usually encourage tell people that at the end of my talk, you're probably going to rush out and have a stiff martini or something, because I'm not real optimistic on long term. I just don't see, I see the deal in place. I mean, I see the components of it, but I don't see either side are particularly keen on reaching the agreement. And I don't see much that's going to get the Iranians off their current nuclear program. I mean, I think they're committed to it. It's a sense of national pride at this point for them that I don't think they'll come off, and they're not going to stop enrichment. Whether we can live with a limited level of enrichment, it's something for U.S. policymakers to decide. But until we get to that point, I don't, there's only a couple of outcomes, which is if they continue on the course, they're going to end up with at least the nuclear capability, or we end up in a conflict. Neither one of which I think is a great option.
We hear a lot about the economic isolation of Iran. Is it happening, and is it really working?
There's probably people in here a lot smarter on its effects than I am. From what I see, yes, it is definitely working. It is having an effect on the Iranians. Thus far, it doesn't seem decisive. In other words, I think the Iranians have been able to weather sanctions, at least to this point, to the point that it hasn't created either a popular backlash that they're always worried about, or forced them to recalculate on the nuclear weapon. I think it has forced them to consider maybe some of their Jalali's statements at some of the recent talks, I think, show that they're a little bit more conciliatory than they had been in the past, and that's probably a result of the international pressure. But I don't think it's driven them to the point where we would like it to be yet. The one thing about Iran, though, I think it's important to keep in mind is Iran doesn't like to be isolated. I mean, they see themselves as a great power. They see themselves as a natural power of the Middle East, and frankly, that's been their historic role. So this, for them, the impact of the sanctions is not only the loss of the economy, it's also the sense of international isolation that bothers them. And I think that works to our advantage as well. Sir.
You made a comment that I'd like to see you expand on. I'm wondering what you see as Iran thinks this, Iran has this strategy. Which Iran are we talking about? In other words, we know the inner workings are very complex. There probably is not a real defined bureaucracy inside their own system that maybe sometimes it makes it difficult for us as the U.S. to know who we're really talking to at what time.
Well, I think there's two things to this. One is Iran, by design, has a pretty complex, diffuse bureaucracy. Never forget, this is a country that used to have a prime minister and a president, both of whom were very powerful positions. And if you look at their current lash-up, there's parliaments, there's an expediency council, guardian council, there's the supreme leader, all these guys sort of compete in. And in each one of those entities, there's guys who don't like each other who fight. I mean, I remember we used to think Ahmadinejad was this hard liner in line with the supreme leader. Well, I think if you look at it today, you realize that's far from the case. So it is a complicated system, and sometimes it's hard to tell. The other piece to this is that what motivates the Iranians, I think, is two factors, particularly the supreme leader, who is ultimately the arbiter of everything. Is they're motivated by, I think, traditional Iranian imperial views. You read some of their statements, and I can pull off statements the Shah made that are very identical, almost identical to it. They see themselves as a great power, and they see the Persian Gulf as the Persian Gulf, not the Arabian Gulf. And so that's one strain that motivates them. The other strain is the revolutionary ideal itself, and this notion that Iran and the revolution is the forefront of a sort of a new Islamic wave in the region, at the time one that was opposed to both the communism and capitalism, and one that's primary function is to defend the downtrodden Shia across the region. And that certainly motivates the supreme leader more than it does some of the Revolutionary Guard officers who are a little bit more military-minded and think in different terms. So the problem with looking at the Iranians is not only is diffuse bureaucracy, but what's driving them is two trains. And Henry Kissinger described them in an op-ed piece a few years ago as the problem with Iran is they're a cause, not a nation state. And I agree with the pause, but I also think they operate as a nation state too, and an imperial nation state in a sense. Although not necessarily one in direct conquest of other states, but when Iranians is always conquered through influence, perhaps more than physical conquest, and that's what they're trying to do across the region. Yeah.
Yeah. Another state in the region that has extreme concerns about Iran is Israel, a close ally of ours. Mm-hmm. Over the past 30 years, have there been time periods when Israeli and U.S. Relations vis-a-vis Iran have coincided, and then when have there been periods perhaps when they have diverged?
There's been quite a lot of that. I mean, one of the great fallacies is somehow the Iranians, the Israelis and the U.S. have always been in lockstep over Iran, and that, you know, as the Iranians would say, what the little Satan does is only at the behest of the great Satan. There has been a lot. The 1980s, for example, as I mentioned, the tanker war and this. The Israelis were actually pushing the United States to increase the arms sales to Iran at the same time that we saw it as a significant threat. The U.S. was cozying up to Iraq at the time as a way of, as a bulwark against Iran and the Iran-Iraq war. The Israelis were adamantly opposed to that policy because they saw Iraq as a greater threat to them. Throughout the 80s, the two were largely out of sync. The only time we were in sync was in the Iranian arms sale business, where the two interests converged and the Israelis sort of got what they wanted, but policy was done for very different reasons by the U.S. than what the Israelis wanted. In the late 1990s, when Clinton made his overture to Hatami and Madeleine Albright gave her speech and apologized for Mossadegh, that was completely contrary to what the Israeli policy wanted, who was looking to figure out ways to isolate Iran because they are fearing an emerging nuclear program in Iran. So that was not something the Israelis wanted. More recently, the interests have converged, and it's over what is clearly a questionable nuclear program, at least in the American and Israelis' minds. So we've seen a convergence of interest on the Iranian problem. So it's been a complicated, twisty path between the two nations. Sir? I think what Iran has always wanted since the 2003 invasion, and I describe in my book what I saw was a pretty concentrated effort by the Iranians to influence the Iraqi Shia population, almost following in the wake of American tanks. They want influence. I mean, Iran wants. I mean, and frankly, from the Iranian perspective, it makes it's a logical thing. Their neighbor, they fought an 8-year war with that killed and wounded probably 2 million Iranians. Their version of World War I. They want to make sure that whatever's in that country is going to be favorably disposed to them, or at least not hostile. So from the outset, it's influence in the Shia community. And I think that's what they want. And now what you see increasingly, of course, is Syria heats up and this sort of growing Sunni-Shia conflict that seems to be really an emerging problem, I think, for the United States and the Middle East. Iran is latching on even more so onto Iraq simply because of that Shia connection against the Sunnis. You've seen it in statements that both Maliki and has come out of Tehran about this, the new emerging Ottoman Empire, I think was what Maliki said to a reporter not too long ago. In his view, it's obviously a Sunni threat. So I think Iran's going to want influence there. And I think if they lose Syria, they're going to double down in Iraq because it gives them more of a buffer state. And frankly, that's in keeping with, there's a good book by Steve Ward called The Immortals. Steve Ward's an Iran analyst over at CIA on the Iranian military and their history. And what you see is this recurring theme of them of needing buffer states and areas of regional influence to provide them strategic depth. And I think Iraq, of course, Hezbollah is doing that now for them, but I think Iraq, they're hoping long term might be the next buffer state for them. Sir.
At which Iran will relinquish its support for Syria, salvaging its street cred in the Arab world?
That's a good question. In my view, no. I think Assad's too important to them, and I think if you look what they're doing with them and Hezbollah and stuff, they're losing a lot of street cred already. That's split the rejectionist movement in Lebanon against the Israelis. It's done a lot, but I think they see Assad as absolutely strategically vital, maintaining some kind of cooperative regime in Syria. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I don't think the sanctions regime are going to perhaps get as much attention in this debate as it should, in part because the Supreme Leader doesn't want it to get the attention. I think his concern is avoiding a repetition of 2009 and the upheavals there. And we'll see. We'll see what they do with the candidate slate. I think 686 candidates applied, and the Guardian Council was supposed to rule today, but when you got 686 people to go through, I suppose it takes some time. But certainly this week, we'll know the slate of candidates and whether guys like Rafsanjani, who tossed his hat in, or some of the other ones who may be either more reformist or at least aligned to Ahmadinejad make it, we'll see. So bottom line is I don't have a good answer, but my suspicion is that we'll see a series of very similar hardline candidates, Rezai, the former IRGC commander, and guys like his ilk, that either one of whom would be acceptable to the supreme leader. In which case, then I don't see any dramatic change. In fact, maybe a hardening of Iranian policy. Sorry, gentleman in the back, yeah.
Back to the Shia question.
That's a great question. Wally Nasser's written a lot about that in some really good books, I think. You know, whether this movement was afoot already, I tend to think it probably has been out there since Iran, you know, well, it's always been out there. Obviously, you know, the Safavid-Ottoman rivalry in the 17th century was very much a Sunni-Shia fight. So it's always been out there. I think between the Cold War and between the rise of Arab socialism, Nasser and this kind of, a lot of these ideas were sort of put in they never went away, but they were downplayed as far as policy. Those governments are all going. The Arab Spring, I think, has put the final nail, and a lot of the these socialist movements that dominate a lot of these countries at the time. So what's replacing it? Well, it's going to be replaced by religion, I think. And I think the Iranian Revolution certainly sparked a lot of this. The Iranians like to take credit for it. But I think the U.S. invasion of Iraq certainly threw fuel on the fire. We exacerbated what is a growing tension in Iraq, and Syria, I think, has taken it to the next level. And most of the countries see everything out there now in these terms, between Sunni and Shia. How the U.S. rides this dragon is going to be very difficult for us because we have our foot in both camps, and frankly, we don't want to be on either side. But I think, you know, if I were a prognosticator as opposed to a historian, I would say that our long-term problem is going to be this Sunni-Shia conflict, and I think it's going to be a real challenge for us. Sir. Yeah, they've made, every once in a while they like to beat their tom-toms on that. You know, in my view, you know, I think that I'll go back to what I think was their view in the 1980s, which is probably a better way of answering the question, is that was always an issue of last resort for them, sort of their nuclear option, for lack of a better word. But, you know, if the U.S. is coming after them hard with regime change or a perception of regime change, their result will be to close the Strait of Hormuz or try to close the Strait of Hormuz. You know, they're in a tough position because if they close the strait, it also means it's closed to them too, and 95% of their economy is based on oil exports, so you sort of cut off your nose to spite your face if you do that. So I you know, despite the pronouncements, my view is that they will, that's probably not a realistic option short of a significant conflict.
Okay, on behalf of the Historical Office of the Secretary of Defense, I'd like to thank Dr. Crist for a very interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you. Oh, appreciate it.